For centuries, knowledge has been hidden in plain sight across the sands of time. Whispers of lost civilizations, cryptic symbols, and forbidden histories have been erased or concealed. What if the truth was never lost, but hidden? Welcome to Eye of Ancient Mysteries, where the past speaks and the future listens. Sit back, open your mind, and prepare to uncover the untold secrets of our world. Let the journey begin now. The origins of the Soviet human-ape hybrid project 95 years ago, in the aftermath of the Bolshevik Revolution, the newly formed Soviet Union launched one of the most bizarre and controversial scientific undertakings in modern history, an attempt to create a hybrid between a human and an ape. The idea, born in the turbulent 1920s, combined ideological ambition, political fanaticism, and a distorted belief in the power of science to reshape nature itself. The project's goal was not simply biological experimentation, but the deliberate creation of a new kind of being, a cross between man and ape. The initiative, from both a moral and a scientific perspective, was highly questionable. Yet, for the ruling elite of the time, and particularly for Joseph Stalin, the prospect of creating such a hybrid was considered invaluable. According to the project's vision, this new creature would possess extraordinary physical strength, but a limited intellect, making it easily controllable. It was expected to be resistant to pain, tireless, and undemanding in terms of food and living conditions. A dream come true for a totalitarian regime in need of obedient laborers and soldiers. In the imagination of Soviet planners, these beings would resemble the war orcs, later described in Tolkien's fiction. Powerful, submissive, and fearless. Such hybrids could serve as a super soldier army or as a cheap, durable workforce for mining operations and large-scale construction projects in Siberia and the Arctic. In 1926, the Soviet dictator Stalin personally authorized a classified program to attempt the laboratory creation of such creatures. The project's scientific leadership was entrusted to the prominent biologist Ilya Ivanov, a world-renowned specialist in artificial insemination and animal breeding. Ivanov's reputation at the time was considerable. Born in 1870 in the town of Shigry, in the Kursk province, the same year Lenin was born, he had already achieved distinction under the Russian Empire. A graduate of Kharkov University in 1896, he initially studied animal physiology. Coming from a wealthy family, Ivanov financed his own study trip to France, where he trained at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, completing both practical and theoretical courses in bacteriology. Upon his return to Russia in 1898, Ivanov shifted his interests toward the physiology of reproduction. He began working at the Imperial Institute for Experimental Medicine and later joined the laboratory of the famed physiologist Ivan Pavlov. He also collaborated with the distinguished embryologist A.O. Kovalevsky at the Zoological Laboratory of the Imperial Academy of Sciences. By the age of 36, Ivanov had already become a professor, celebrated for developing a method for the artificial insemination of mares, which was widely used across Europe. At the Ascania, Nova Reserve in the Kherson region, a world-famous experimental breeding station, Ivanov began his pioneering work on hybridization. There, he successfully crossbred mice with rats, guinea pigs of different breeds, donkeys with zebras, bison with domestic cattle, and horses with the wild Przewalski's horse. He even managed to create hybrids between bulls and deer. Ivanov was not only successful in producing these hybrids, but also meticulous in studying their behavior, health, and reproductive potential. By 1910, his ambitions had expanded beyond interspecies breeding. He publicly proposed, before the World Congress of Zoologists in Graz, Austria, Hungary, that it might be scientifically feasible to hybridize humans and apes. In his presentation, Ivanov declared that the method could eliminate any possible moral objections, arguing that such concerns are absurd. He reasoned that if only the cells, not the individuals themselves, are joined, there can be nothing immoral about it. Still, within Russia, Ivanov refrained from discussing these radical ideas openly. He was well aware that conservative forces, particularly those influenced by the Church, would fiercely oppose such progressive experiments. His moment came after the Bolshevik Revolution, when Soviet ideology embraced militant atheism and the glorification of science as the ultimate power capable of dethroning God and mastering life itself. Under the new regime, Ivanov's once heretical ideas were suddenly viewed as revolutionary and ideologically useful. The communist leadership saw in his project not only scientific innovation, but also propaganda potential. If successful, it would deal a devastating blow to the religious concept of divine creation, providing tangible proof that life, even human life, could be manufactured in a laboratory. Thus, what began as one man's eccentric vision would soon become a state-backed experiment that blurred the line between scientific progress and moral transgression. Ilya Ivanov's early career and his path toward the Soviet hybridization project, when the Russian Empire collapsed in 1917 and the Bolsheviks took power. The new Soviet state immediately sought to establish itself as a nation of science, progress, and atheism. Old moral codes and religious prohibitions were to be replaced by the worship of technological advancement. It was in this ideological atmosphere that Professor Ilya Ivanovich Ivanov, already a respected figure in zoology and reproductive physiology, found the perfect environment for his most ambitious and controversial experiments. By the early 1920s, Ivanov had already made a name for himself across Europe. His groundbreaking work in artificial insemination and animal hybridization had been widely published. He had received invitations to lecture in France, Germany, and the Netherlands, and his methods were even adopted by Western breeding programs. In Soviet Russia, he was hailed as a symbol of the new scientific elite, a man who could rebuild nature itself through science. However, after years of civil war and economic chaos, the Soviet Union lacked both the funding and the biological materials necessary for Ivanov's next big step, the creation of a hybrid between man and ape. The project, though radical, aligned perfectly with the Bolshevik vision of reshaping life, society, and even human nature through scientific intervention. In 1924, Ivanov presented a detailed proposal to the Soviet Academy of Sciences titled "On the Possibility and Conditions for the Creation of a Human-Ape Hybrid." The paper outlined a series of experiments that, in his view, could demonstrate the shared biological lineage between humans and primates, supporting the Marxist-Leninist rejection of divine creation. His plan was simple in concept. Though ethically staggering, fertilize female chimpanzees or orangutans with human sperm and observe whether the embryos would develop. If successful, the resulting hybrid would be living proof that humans and apes were of the same evolutionary substance, the ultimate vindication of Darwin's theory in a form visible to the naked eye. Ivanov's proposal was presented at a time when Soviet science was driven by ideology as much as curiosity. The party demanded material proof of Marxist principles, and what could serve that goal better than the creation of a new being, half human, half animal, born of laboratory procedure rather than divine will? Stalin's government approved the project, recognizing its potential propaganda value. In official documents, the hybridization experiment was described as a materialist challenge to bourgeois mysticism and clerical dogma. Funding was secured through the Soviet Academy of Sciences and the People's Commissariat of Education, while political oversight was quietly delegated to the NKVD, the precursor of the KGB. Yet even with state approval, Ivanov faced a practical obstacle. There were no living great apes in Russia suitable for the experiment. The Soviet Union had no colonies, and thus no direct access to chimpanzees, gorillas, or orangutans. To solve this, Ivanov turned once again to his old contacts in France. He wrote directly to Édouard Roques, the director of the Pasteur Institute in Paris, where he had once studied. Roques, fascinated by the audacity of the project, agreed to collaborate. In 1926, the French government authorized Ivanov to conduct hybridization experiments using chimpanzees at the Pasteur Institute's Colonial Research Station in Kindia, French Guinea, in West Africa. To the astonishment of many, this collaboration was approved even amid rising ethical concerns in Europe. France's colonial authorities in Africa agreed to assist, seeing the project as a contribution to biological science, and perhaps as a means of strengthening ties with the Soviet Union. In late 1926, Ivanov, his son Ilya Jr., and several assistants departed for Africa. Their mission to conduct the world's first controlled attempts at human-ape hybridization. Their destination, the Pasteur Institute's experimental primate station in Kindia, nestled within the dense forests of what is now Guinea. But beneath the official language of evolutionary research and comparative biology, the project carried darker undertones. Secret documents later revealed that certain party officials, and possibly Stalin himself, hoped for far more than scientific proof of Darwinism. The long-term vision, as recorded in classified correspondence, was to create a subhuman worker type, beings of immense strength, capable of enduring brutal conditions, who would not demand wages or harbor revolutionary thoughts. For Ivanov, however, the experiment remained, at least on paper, a purely scientific challenge, the ultimate test of his theory of hybridization. His journey to Africa marked not only the beginning of this audacious chapter in science, but also the beginning of his personal downfall. What began as an effort to advance biology would soon turn into a nightmare of political intrigue, ethical scandal, and personal tragedy. The African expedition, the first attempts at human-ape hybridization. In December 1926, Professor Ilya Ivanov and his small research team arrived in French Guinea, West Africa, then a colony of France. Their destination was the Pasteur Institute's experimental primate station near Kindia, a remote site surrounded by dense equatorial forest. This was one of the few places in the world where a significant population of chimpanzees could be kept, observed, and used for controlled biological experiments. The station's facilities were modest wooden structures surrounded by wire enclosures, a small laboratory equipped for veterinary work, and a handful of French colonial staff under the direction of Dr. Emile Roux, who had authorized Ivanov's presence. For the Soviet scientist, this place represented not only an exotic research environment, but the only chance to test his most daring hypothesis under real biological conditions. The purpose of the mission, officially recorded in both French and Soviet documents, was to explore comparative reproductive processes among higher primates. Yet behind this neutral phrasing, the real goal was explicit: to attempt the fertilization of female chimpanzees with human sperm. According to surviving correspondence, Ivanov's plan involved several distinct phases. First, he would capture and medically examine a group of mature female chimpanzees to ensure they were in reproductive condition. Then, using techniques he had perfected during years of animal hybridization, he would artificially inseminate the apes with human genetic material. The samples were to be provided by European volunteers under medical supervision. Though the exact identities of these men were never officially disclosed, the French colonial authorities were both intrigued and uneasy. While the Pasteur Institute approved the project as legitimate science, some local officials and missionaries expressed moral objections. Rumors spread among the indigenous population that the Europeans were trying to create monsters or breed a new kind of man. These accounts appear in colonial archives from Conakry, reporting unrest among local workers and difficulty maintaining labor at the chimpanzee enclosures. Ivanov's own diaries, later recovered in part by Soviet historians, suggest that the African conditions were far more difficult than anticipated. The apes were hard to keep healthy, many suffered from tropical diseases, and the laboratory conditions were rudimentary at best. Several chimpanzees died shortly after arrival due to stress, malnutrition, or infection. Despite these obstacles, Ivanov pressed forward. In early 1927, he performed the first series of insemination attempts. The exact number of procedures is unknown, but later reports mention at least 3 female chimpanzees subjected to artificial insemination using human samples. The results were inconclusive. No pregnancies were confirmed, and the surviving chimpanzees showed no sign of developing embryos. Ivanov noted the failures meticulously, attributing them to the stress of captivity and poor timing in the reproductive cycles of the animals. Still, he remained convinced that with better conditions and more controlled timing, the hybridization could succeed. However, the project was already drawing unwanted attention. French newspapers began hinting at Soviet experiments on human ape breeding in West Africa. Colonial administrators in Dakar and Paris, fearing a scandal, began to pressure the Pasteur Institute to terminate the work. In their internal memos, they warned that if the African population believed white men are creating beasts from men and apes, violent resistance might follow. Under growing scrutiny, the French government eventually ordered a halt to the insemination trials. Ivanov was instructed to restrict his work to purely zoological studies of primate reproduction. Deeply frustrated but outwardly compliant, he spent the remainder of his stay studying ape behavior and collecting biological samples. By the end of 1927, the African expedition had failed to produce a hybrid offspring, but it had succeeded in capturing the imagination of both the scientific community and the political elite back in Moscow. Ivanov returned to the Soviet Union in early 1928, carrying not results, but a new conviction if his experiment could not be completed abroad. It would have to be finished on Soviet soil, under Soviet control. The transfer to the Soviet Union, secret facilities, and the search for human volunteers. When Professor Ilya Ivanov returned from French Guinea in early 1928, the atmosphere in Moscow had changed. The Soviet Union was now entering a phase of intense industrialization and scientific ambition under Stalin's emerging command economy. The leadership sought to demonstrate that Soviet science could achieve what capitalist laboratories could not, to reshape life itself through rational planning and technological mastery. Despite the lack of tangible results from Africa, Ivanov's reports were received with cautious enthusiasm by the Soviet Academy of Sciences and by certain circles within the People's Commissariat for Education, Narkompros. His project aligned perfectly with the ideological mood of the time, the belief that the boundaries between nature and humanity could be conquered by science in the service of socialism. However, there was also a new level of secrecy. The work could no longer be conducted under foreign supervision or colonial oversight. It had to be done entirely within Soviet territory, far from Western journalists or religious interference. To that end, the government approved the establishment of a primate research station in Sukhumi, in the subtropical region of Abkhazia, near the Black Sea. The location was ideal, isolated, secure, yet accessible to Moscow by rail. It offered the climate and vegetation necessary to maintain chimpanzees and baboons imported from Africa. The station was officially designated for biological and veterinary studies on primates. but its true purpose was known only to a handful of party officials and scientists close to Ivanov. Funding came partly from the Soviet Academy of Sciences, but also, according to later declassified reports, from the OGPU, the forerunner of the KGB. The intelligence services saw potential in the research not only for biology but for propaganda and even military applications. The idea that Soviet science might create a new type of worker, a being of strength and obedience, fascinated some within the party's inner circles. At Sukhumi, Ivanov began rebuilding what he had lost in Africa. Dozens of cages were erected among the palm groves. Local workers were recruited to care for the apes, while supplies of medical instruments and chemical agents arrived from Moscow. The first group of chimpanzees, acquired through French intermediaries, reached the station in late 1928, exhausted and malnourished but alive. Ivanov's next challenge was far more delicate, finding human volunteers. He needed women willing to be artificially inseminated with ape sperm to complete the reciprocal phase of his hybridization plan. In his theoretical model, cross-fertilization could succeed only if attempted in both directions, human male to ape female, and ape male to human female. To secure permission, Ivanov approached several institutions, including the Moscow Medical Academy and Sukhumi State Hospital, arguing that the experiment would prove or disprove one of Darwin's most fundamental questions, the closeness of human and primate physiology. Officially, the state neither approved nor denied his request. Instead, he was told to proceed quietly, without unnecessary publicity. Archival documents later revealed that a small number of women, possibly 5, volunteered or were recruited under unclear circumstances. Some accounts suggest they were ideologically motivated communists who believed their participation would serve science and the state. Others were described as widows or orphans offered modest compensation. The identities of these women were never released, and no verifiable record of insemination results has survived. By mid-1929, Ivanov's primate population was declining rapidly. Disease, malnutrition, and poor conditions devastated the colony. Several chimpanzees died before any new insemination procedures could be performed. Ivanov repeatedly petitioned Moscow for more animals and resources, but his requests were delayed amid growing political suspicion toward unproductive scientists. Meanwhile, rumors about his research began circulating among local party committees in Abkhazia. Stories of half-human embryos and women impregnated by apes reached the ears of regional security officers. The OGPU, once a patron of the project, now viewed Ivanov as a potential liability. In an era of rising paranoia, his correspondence with French scientists and his earlier work abroad made him appear politically unreliable. In late 1930, the order came from Moscow. Professor Ivanov was to be dismissed and reassigned. The Sukhumi station continued its existence as a primate research facility, but its experiments shifted to conventional virology and physiology. The dream of a human-ape hybrid, once seen as a triumph of Soviet science, was now officially erased from the record. Shortly afterward, Ivanov was arrested during a purge of intellectuals accused of bourgeois pseudo-science. He was sentenced to internal exile in Kazakhstan, where he died of a stroke in 1932. A broken man, his life's work condemned to obscurity. The Sukhumi station, however, survived. In later decades, it would become one of the Soviet Union's most secretive centers for biological research, including early studies of viral agents and neurophysiology, a legacy that quietly descended from Ivanov's ill-fated experiment. Suppression, legacy, and the modern rediscovery of Ivanov's experiments. For decades after Ilya Ivanov's death, the story of the Soviet hybridization project disappeared almost completely from public knowledge. The archives that contained his correspondence, laboratory notes, and the administrative files of the Sukhumi Primate Research Station were sealed, classified under the category of sensitive biological experiments. Official Soviet scientific histories of the 1930s and 1940s made no mention of him. In the great encyclopedias of the time, Ivanov was reduced to a single line: pioneer of artificial insemination in domestic animals. His extraordinary work with apes, his African expeditions, and his contacts with French institutions were omitted entirely. The regime had buried the evidence as effectively as it had buried countless other inconvenient experiments of the early Bolshevik era. The Sukhumi station itself, meanwhile, took on a new identity. Under Stalin's rule, it became a research hub for comparative physiology, psychology, and virology. Primates were used to test vaccines, study brain function, and even simulate the effects of radiation and microgravity. By the 1950s, the center had grown into one of the largest primate research facilities in the world. But its true origins were known only to a few senior scientists. When Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet Union entered a period of slow political thaw. Historians began to re-examine early scientific ventures, and some of Ivanov's unpublished papers were quietly rediscovered. Yet it was not until the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s that the full extent of his hybridization project came to light. In 1992, Russian journalist and historian Kirill Rossianov uncovered a series of confidential letters and government documents from the archives of the Academy of Sciences. They revealed, in Ivanov's own words, his plans to test cross-fertilization between anthropoid apes and Homo sapiens by artificial means. The papers included requests for funding, reports to the Commissariat of Education, and correspondence with French zoologists. For the first time, Western readers could see that the project had been real, state-supported, and meticulously planned. The story caused a brief storm in international media. Newspapers across Europe and the United States ran headlines about Stalin's ape men and the Soviet experiment to create a human-chimpanzee hybrid. In Russia, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed it as Cold War sensationalism, while others saw it as a tragic emblem of early Soviet utopianism, when even the laws of biology were seen as conquerable by ideology. Modern scientists who reviewed Ivanov's methods generally agreed that the chances of success had been virtually zero. The genetic distance between humans and chimpanzees, though close in evolutionary terms, is biologically insurmountable for cross-species fertilization without advanced genetic manipulation. Ivanov, however, worked decades before the discovery of DNA structure or modern reproductive technology. To him, hybridization was not madness, but a continuation of the same principles that had already produced hybrids among horses, zebras, and other mammals. Still, his motives remain a subject of debate. Some scholars portray Ivanov as a true scientist driven by curiosity, pursuing a radical hypothesis to its logical conclusion. Others suggest he was a man trapped by political forces, pressured by Soviet authorities eager for proof that evolution, not divine creation, governed humanity. In this interpretation, the human-ape hybrid was to be the ultimate biblical creature, physical evidence that man was nothing more than another animal shaped by material laws. After 1992, the Sukhumi Station, now within the independent Republic of Georgia, opened some of its facilities to journalists. Many of the original buildings were still standing, overtaken by tropical vegetation. In one decaying laboratory, rusty cages and surgical tables were found, along with records of primate research from the 1930s to the 1980s. No physical evidence of hybridization attempts survived, but the atmosphere of secrecy was palpable. Today, Ilya Ivanov's legacy occupies a strange place in the history of science. He is remembered both as a visionary pioneer of artificial insemination, whose techniques transformed animal breeding worldwide, and as the architect of one of the most ethically disturbing experiments ever conceived. In 2008, the Russian Academy of Sciences formally recognized Ivanov's contribution to reproductive biology, but avoided any mention of his human-ape hybridization work. Meanwhile, documentaries, novels, and speculative studies continue to revisit his life, portraying him alternately as a tragic genius, a victim of ideology, or a symbol of science's dangerous ambition. Whatever interpretation one accepts, the record is clear. Between 1926 and 1930, in the name of progress and human advancement, the Soviet Union sponsored a genuine attempt to create life that blurred the line between man and beast. It failed, but it revealed how, in the pursuit of utopia, the boundary between imagination and horror can vanish almost completely. Nearly a century after Ivanov's secret experiments, the questions his work raised have returned, not as speculative fantasy, but as real scientific possibilities. In laboratories across the world, geneticists now possess the tools that Ivanov could only imagine: CRISPR gene editing, stem cell manipulation, and cross-species embryo research. In the early 21st century, scientists began creating what are called human-animal chimeras, organisms that contain a small percentage of human cells inside animal embryos. These studies, unlike Ivanov's crude hybridization attempts, are conducted under strict ethical supervision and aim to solve urgent medical problems: growing human organs inside animals for transplantation, understanding genetic diseases, or studying brain development. Yet the moral unease surrounding such research echoes the same fears Ivanov's work once provoked. The idea of mixing human and non-human biology, of creating life that is neither entirely one nor the other, continues to test society's sense of where the line between human and animal truly lies. In 2019, Japanese scientist Hiromitsu Nakachi received government approval to grow human cells in animal embryos, including pigs and monkeys, and allow them to develop beyond the early stages of gestation. The stated goal was to produce transplantable organs, but the announcement reignited global debate. Was this science or hubris? Progress or transgression? For some bioethicists, the parallels to Ivanov's ambition are unavoidable. Though the methods differ profoundly, the philosophical question remains the same. If we can create new forms of life, should we? And if we do, what responsibilities accompany such creation? Modern researchers emphasize one key distinction. Ivanov's work was driven by ideology, by the Soviet regime's desire to prove materialist doctrine and to harness biology for political ends. Today's genetic research, in contrast, is guided by medical necessity, regulatory frameworks, and international oversight. Nevertheless, the specter of the ape man experiment remains a cautionary symbol, a reminder of what happens when science serves power instead of ethics. Some scientists and historians have even speculated on an indirect biological legacy of Ivanov's experiments. According to fringe theories, unsupported by hard evidence but persistent in popular imagination, the handling of blood, tissue, and primate samples during the 1920s African expeditions could have exposed researchers to simian viruses later linked to the origins of HIV. While mainstream virologists dismiss any direct connection, the coincidence of time and place, French Guinea 1920s, primate experimentation, continues to fascinate those who study the deep roots of zoonotic disease. In this sense, Ivanov's project represents more than a historical curiosity. It is a case study in how the boundaries of scientific ethics evolve, and how early transgressions often foreshadow later dilemmas. His experiments anticipated not only the technical ambitions of future biology, but also its existential dangers. From eugenics to genetic surveillance, from cloning to artificial intelligence. Today, as humanity contemplates altering its own genetic code, reviving extinct species, or merging biology with machines, Ivanov's story serves as both warning and prophecy. It reminds us that scientific progress is not inherently moral, that curiosity, when unrestrained by conscience, can lead to horrors disguised as enlightenment. And yet, paradoxically, it also reveals the enduring courage of the scientific impulse, the desire to know, to test, to reach beyond the possible. Ilya Ivanov was not a monster. He was a man of his time, caught between discovery and delusion, reason and ideology. His tragedy was that he lived in an age that mistook power for truth and experimentation for progress. In the end, the Soviet human-ape hybrid project failed not only because of biological impossibility, but because it sought to reduce the mystery of life to a political formula. It tried to prove that man was nothing more than an animal, and in doing so, it revealed the most human flaw of all, the will to dominate nature, even at the cost of becoming monstrous oneself. In the early years of the Soviet Union, a dream was born, a dream to merge beast and man, to forge a new kind of being. It was a dream of control, of domination over nature, over biology, over God himself. For Stalin's regime, it was science in the service of ideology. For Ilya Ivanov, it was the culmination of a lifetime spent chasing the secrets of creation. And for history, it became one of the most disturbing footnotes in humanity's long and uneasy relationship with its own origins. In the humid forests of French Guiana, Ivanov's syringes pierced the boundaries between species. In the sterile halls of Soviet laboratories, ethics dissolved beneath the promise of power. But the dream that began with revolutionary zeal ended in silence. The experiments failed, the records were sealed, and Ivanov himself was erased by the machine he once served. When he died in exile in 1932, the Soviet ape man project was already forgotten, a relic of a darker vision of progress. Yet the questions it raised never truly vanished. Today, as geneticists rewrite DNA, as artificial intelligence learns to mimic human thought, as the line between the natural and the artificial blurs once again, the story of Ivanov returns, not as legend but as warning, because science, like power, is never evil or good by itself. It reflects the hand that wields it, and the heart that guides that hand.